Hi, welcome to Lecture 6 in Soccer 3666. This topic is going to kind of bring together the first 6 weeks of the course through the lens of the notion of the savvy and the sucker, in a way of talking about consumption. In part 1, I'll talk about the kind of just to introduce it, and then talk a little bit about the sucker, and the second part about the savvy, and the third part I'll introduce an example that kind of brings together both of those things through the notion of subculture. So I think the reading does a quite good outline of aspects of this. The sucker essentially relates back to the Frankfurt School Marxist tradition, particularly around the ideas of the cultural dupe. So I'm going to look today at a little bit more detail of maybe the actual pragmatics of how that may work in ways that they're actual kind of forms of knowledge that are trying to trick people into and manipulate them to buy stuff through the notion of retail psychology. The notion of the savvy is a way of moving beyond that dupe and thinking a little bit about, sure, we may be manipulated, but there's ways of finding space, autonomy, having tactics, using strategies, using modes of appropriation to move beyond that kind of model of the vapid cultural dupe. So in subcultures in particular, there's been an argument, these are good examples of that, of kind of rebellious, creative, artistic forms of consumption that are much more savvy than the sucker model. So there's a paradox happening here. We can't really rely too much on buying things that we don't actually need, and if we are manipulated for the larger purposes of the economy and existing power structures, or is there more kind of choice and identity around these things? That's the kind of paradox between this manipulation and notions of kind of self-identity. So this week I'm going to kind of just focus on the moments of consumption around identity. I'm not going to really talk about the health and environmental aspects in terms of these systems. We'll look at that later in the course. So in terms of the sucker, again, as I said earlier on, this kind of is heavily influenced by the notion of the Frankfurt School, that Marxist idea that the consumer culture itself has been a key, I suppose, factor in preventing the revolution that Marx predicted a couple of centuries ago. And there's, the studies around retail psychology kind of continue that lineage, and they illustrate the various ways that, companies, shops, shopping centres try and manipulate us to, go into the shops to buy particular things. And these use kind of forms of effect that I was talking about earlier in the course, particularly around, the heaviness of plates and how we relate, notions of value to that kind of thing. So these techniques are probably increasingly well known today, and shows like the Gruen transfer and the checkout, I think, on the ABC kind of highlight these things in many ways. And so straight away, I think, is if there's a kind of strong representation of these things in popular media, can we be completely suckers? I think we increasingly have understanding that we are being manipulated in these situations. So some of the ways that retail psychology does this is through smells. The pumping of fresh bread into supermarkets was an early version of this to make people, particularly if they were feeling particularly hungry, to manipulate into buying more food. You can buy fake versions of the new car smell. Certainly the way that lighting and temperatures are manipulated in various consumption spaces, and certainly the architecture of space is a well-known version of this retail psychology. Supermarkets are constantly moving around the products and what's in the aisles. They obviously put things at eye level at the counters when you're checking out to try and get that more purchase happening in that moment there. And the rearranging of the aisles is seen to be important, so people don't get into just a routine of buying the same stuff and knowing where everything is and just looking at those places. If you move stuff around, you then have to look for the things that you need or want, and it actually seems to increase the possibility that you'll buy more stuff because you'll notice more things. The use of music's been used certainly in these spaces as well. and it's been particularly used in public space to try and get rid of young people. So music there was used, there used to be in the 90s in particular, classical music played where young people would be loitering around these shopping centres in an attempt to try and get them to move on because, apparently young people hate classical music. And it's even like the example in the reading about how the American apparel store, The Gap, doesn't hang its clothing up on shelves or on coat hangers. It has them in piles on tables, kind of encouraging people to touch them and have some kind of tactile relationship that may increase the possibility of buying this stuff. So these are the various retail psychology measures that are used to try and manipulate us. But it's important to then show that we're not always manipulated. We don't always buy the things in these spaces. And as we'll look at, in the next part of the lecture, when we do buy stuff, we don't necessarily use them in the way that they're meant to be used. We use things in all kinds of weird and wonderful ways. So I've put some links to some documentaries here that I think, if you're interested in this kind of manipulative point of view, they're very, very interesting here. So The Persuaders, like a bit older now, it's about the way that advertising manipulates us. The Merchants of Cool is a really great documentary around the cool hunting industry that came out of the late 90s, where people were employed to go out in the streets and try and find cool subcultures before they really became a thing, so advertising could use them. And certainly the use of images of women in advertising and the ways that sex sells is an important thing to consider as well. So if you want to delve into that deeper, please have a look at those videos.